Well, thank you all very much for being here. And I suppose thank you especially to Sweden for precipitating a political crisis just before I arrived. I'm guessing to make the Brits here feel a little better about our situation. So thank you very much indeed for that. But they're not unrelated, of course. They're not unrelated. Because I think what's happening at the moment is that all of our political systems that we've come to grow up with and understand are being disrupted. And this is, I think, what journalists are sometimes getting wrong. You have heard over the last several months, over the last couple of years, a series of stories about problems with the internet. Shadowy data analytics companies, Russian interference in elections, homophobia online, internet trolling, untaxable cryptocurrencies, and so on. These aren't to be seen in isolation. These are all part of essentially the same problem, which is that we have an old analog democracy built up at one very particular time with one set of technologies and a brand new digital technology, and the two things do not work very well together. And all these different stories, I think we can see them as tremors of tectonic plates crashing against each other. And I think that's more helpful than constantly whinging and moaning about big tech companies or blaming one side or the other. That's not really helpful. What is helpful is understanding that this is a deep underlying structural problem. It's not going to go away. But now is the time to start thinking about solutions, because we are currently going through quite a dramatic tech backlash at the moment. I mean, I've written a book called How the Internet's Killing Democracy, so I am partly to blame for that. But we are going through a tech backlash, and my great concern is that that is spiraling out of control, and people are going to turn against all these wonderful technologies that could help us, basically smash them all up, and all the wonderful benefits that we could enjoy are lost. And we need to make sure that does not happen. I'm going to give you 3 stories about how I think journalists are getting this slightly wrong, about this relationship between technology and democracy, and a few ideas for each about what we may do about it. Now let's start with Bond villain Alexander Nix. I mean, with a name like Alexander Nix and a kind of look like this, he was always going to be the head of a controversial data analytics firm, wasn't he? It was written in the stars. But this is the man who was the boss of Cambridge Analytica. You're probably, given the work you do, roughly familiar with the story. You're probably all surprised, frankly, about how surprised everybody was when this story broke. Some of you are probably thinking, wow, we do some of that stuff. That's not even that difficult, what they're doing. Now, I actually helped to break this story with the BBC over a year ago, and I think it's been wildly misreported what actually happened here with Cambridge Analytica and the Trump campaign. So it has, as it has been told, as you have probably heard about it, that this company somehow managed to develop a magical psychological warfare tool that could predict everybody's personality types. And that was then used to be able to somehow change the minds of millions of voters that would have ordinarily voted for Clinton and convince them to vote for Donald Trump because they saw some Facebook adverts. Yeah, I know, yeah. I mean, wouldn't imagine if it was that easy. Your job, say, it would be fantastic, wouldn't it? It's not like that, of course. Actually, I'm afraid to say some people have found it easier to blame Alexander Nix or Cambridge Analytica than to ask far harder questions about why their candidate simply wasn't good enough. Be that as it may, the story of Cambridge Analytica, I think, is in a sense far more worrying, because what they did is pretty standard, pretty ordinary, pretty widespread, and people obviously don't like it very much. So this is really what happened. As you probably are roughly aware, Cambridge Analytica built up a data set of something like 5,000 data points that they purchased legally through Axiom or other data brokerage companies. They collected some of their own data and essentially tried to model 250 million Americans with their 5,000 data points for each. Okay, pretty standard stuff. They went over to the Trump administration team in San Antonio, Texas, as the campaign was starting. And they matched their data set with the Republican Party's data set, known as Voter Vault, which was based on years of collecting data about how people voted for the Republican Party. Were they strong Republican supporters? Were they members of the party? And so on. And they essentially just tried to work out what is the demographic and the interests and concerns, the web browsing history, the purchasing patterns, the magazine subscriptions, the car ownership, the credit rating of people who we think might be persuaded to vote for Donald Trump. People that maybe once voted Republican but haven't for a long time. What are they? Who are they? And they found something like 13 million of those people that they thought they could reach through Facebook advertising. About 6 weeks into the campaign, they looked at their data sets and they realized that they had enough of these persuadable voters to possibly be able to win Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. 3 key swing states that everybody said was hardcore Clinton territory, would never be won by Trump. But Cambridge Analytica said, yeah, we think we can win these states. We think we got the numbers. And so the Trump team shifted loads of their budget into those 3 states, spent $85 million on targeted Facebook adverts to get to those people, and even shifted some of Donald Trump's sort of speech route through those states. And when the results came back on election night, as you know, well, you know who won the election, but what you maybe don't know is that he won those 3 states, each of them, by less than 1 percentage point. He won Wisconsin by, I think it was 11,000 or 20,000 votes only. And a later internal paper by Facebook found that they were just significantly better than Clinton at using all the Facebook tools. They ran more iterations of ads. They were more likely to get interactions on their content. So did Cambridge Analytica have a huge say in the election? Well, it's always hard to distinguish a single thing. But I think, yeah, I think they probably did. But just because they used stuff that everybody else was using, but they were doing it slightly better. This is what worries me about this. The drift into this type of personalized advertising, I think, is not so damaging because anything they did was illegal, but because it seems like it's chipping away at people's trust and confidence in how elections actually work. So, for example, how do we hold a politician to account if, in say 10 years from now, each person receives a completely unique advert from the same candidate that's a different message entirely? How do we have the big public debate that we're supposed to at election time if everybody's receiving a completely different message? How is it that a regulator is supposed to be able to monitor that adverts are true and honest and objective if it's only being received by the person that sees it? You know, during the Brexit referendum, the Leave campaign were running Facebook adverts that said the European Union was trying to stop British people from drinking cups of tea. And you're surprised at the result in the end? Well, I mean, it was surprising it was only 52-48. But this is a big problem, that it slowly chips away at the integrity and the trust of how our elections are being fought. That's the challenge, that's the threat. Not that one election may have been swung this way or that, but imagine if we carry on the same path for the next 10, 15, 20 years, whether people will trust in the integrity of the system and that the people that are meant to watch that system can keep tabs on it. And the reason I think this is very important is because of the direction of travel. So of course, as you all know, we're all collecting lots of data about ourselves through all of our smart devices in our homes now, and our baby monitors and our smart fridges and our smart cars and our smart coffee machines. And don't know if anyone's got a smart coffee machine, but I wouldn't do that if I were you personally, because I'd be very worried about getting up in the morning, going downstairs to find that my smart coffee machine had been hacked by Ukrainians and they were demanding a Bitcoin for me to unlock my coffee machine to get my coffee in the morning. This is definitely going to happen. What is definitely also going to happen, of course, is that politicians will be working out, using the latest ad tech, how can we figure out the correlation between people's diet behavior and their Fitbit, and well, we've worked out that you, sir, tend to eat at 5:30 p.m. and between 5 and 5:30 the tone of your language is slightly angrier because you're hungry, and we know that is associated with openness to tough on law and order candidates. So 5:15 p.m. in comes an advert through your smart fridge. And this sounds ludicrous, but let me tell you, if anyone had have said to me 10 years ago that the 2016 US election would involve the use of personalized adverts through a free social media platform called Facebook, I would have thought that was crazy as well. The task here, therefore, for people in this room, for all of us, is this is pretty simple first off, is we have to update the law. We have to make sure that the way that online adverts are being run are completely in line with the way offline adverts are being run on TVs or billboards. And somebody's got to help build the technology to make sure that can happen. I want to see every single political party having to publish every single advert that they post. And then some snazzy technology is going to have to go through all this, filter it, help journalists to make sense of all of it. The other thing, of course, is to make advertising technology more transparent, so people can see where their money's going and where it's being spent. And I know a lot of you work in this area. If there is a single use for that damn blockchain everyone keeps talking about, it's in making advertising technology more transparent. And this would help greatly with our integrity of our elections. And this, of course, matters for all of us, because when people stop losing faith in the way the elections run, they start losing faith in politics, and they start dropping out. Okay, so that's Cambridge Analytica. I think misunderstood, mistold. We've missed the point of that story, but it's very important. Here's another story, a second story. This is Tommy Robinson, and some of you probably are roughly familiar with him. He's a former leader of a radical right-wing group in the UK called the English Defence League, part of of course, a sort of continent-wide, even beyond that, growth in the popularity of populist right-wing, often populist anti-Islam movements. Now, it's been common to say that groups like this, people like him, they're very good at using social media. I mean, that's a pretty obvious thing, and it's obvious why. They were all early adopters. Why? Because they felt like they couldn't get their voice out on the mainstream media, so they went straight to platforms like Facebook before anybody else and built up a real grassroots movement. I wrote a 2011 paper about the Swedish Democrats, saying they're going to get much bigger than they are now because they're way better than everybody else in Sweden at using these platforms. No one likes "I told you so," do they? But I just wanted to put that in there anyway. This is my one chance. I'm in Sweden. And that's true. All of that's true. That's kind of obvious. We get that now. And there's a sort of structural reason for that. But there's something more going on here. I spent several months following this guy around all across Europe as he was setting up a new anti-Islam movement. And it's often said that people like him surround themselves with fake news and lies and misinformation, and that's the problem with social media at the moment. That is not entirely true. There's a bit of truth in that, of course, but far more common for him and others like him is to surround themselves with selectively chosen true stories. So they will spend their time sourcing from all across the internet, from stories all around the world, genuine news stories that corroborate the worldview. Islam and the West are incompatible, the authorities are too scared to admit it, if you say it you'll be tarred as a racist. You're probably familiar with that. There are always enough stories around the world to be able to corroborate that worldview, true stories. The problem is they're all one-sided, they're cherry-picked, they're not giving the whole story. But that is a lot harder of a problem to deal with. Because if you say, well, you're just making stuff up, you're lying, you're full of rubbish and nonsense, They'll always say back to you, oh really, is that true? Look at all these stories, look at all these true stories that I've got. And they'll always then say to you, as they would say to me, Jamie, you're part of that media elite establishment that's trying to shut us down, that's trying to tar us. It's a very difficult thing to tackle. This is the problem. All of us, in some ways, are guilty of that. We are all slightly involved in sort of creating coherent and plausible world narratives around ourselves that are believable. And I think this is the bigger message that I want to put to you, that in some senses, populists aren't just benefiting from social media. All of us are becoming slightly populist in our way of doing things. This is a misconception from the 1990s that is behind some of this. The idea was that if we're all connected, we all have access to infinite information, we all get to speak to each other, we'll all become more informed, we'll all become nicer, we'll all become wiser, and our politics will be better. I believed that. I certainly believed that. I don't feel like that's quite how it's going at the moment. Politics is becoming slightly angrier, slightly more polarized, slightly more aggressive. And the reason, of course, is that when you are confronted with overwhelming amounts of information and data and facts and charts and blogs and everything else, you can really only deal with that at a very emotional, almost gut level. And I think that is what's kind of driving this shift in politics that's making all of us slightly more aggressive and angry. And many of us well-minded people are partly responsible for that. And that is a lot harder to deal with. And the reason I think this is a problem is because it is a perfect situation for the strong man, for the populist, for the authoritarian to come in and say, when everyone's confused and there's constantly conflicting stories, to come in and say, I can deliver you from this confusion. I can deliver simple, immediate promises that will solve all of these problems. That is the underlying structural reason these platforms are better for this anti-establishment type of politics. Now, some of you are going to be old enough to remember, as I do, when 10, 12, 20 years ago, when you used to go on holiday and you'd take your pictures with your camera and then you'd come back from holiday and you'd have to take your film into a shop and you had to pay like, I don't know, euros and euros to get it developed, to get your 20 photos, and you'd wait for a week and then they'd come back and they were all shit. And I just think that people who are like 20 years old must think that was mad. What are you doing? The whole world has now moved onto Instagram, where you can get things quickly, immediately, send them off again, retake them, do them, no compromises whatsoever. Politics is still basically the old model of taking your photographs to the pharmacy and waiting for them to get delivered. And so populist movements are just far more in tune culturally with the technology of the day, because they are offering politics which is immediate and perfect and with no compromises. And that is partly a fault of democracy. Democracy has not changed. It's barely changed a jot for 100 years, while everything around us has. So I think that there's some problems we need to address here too. The structural system of social media, of a lot of it, of course, as you all know about the ad tech model, it encourages you to stay online for as long as possible, and we all like watching emotive content, which means the more emotional stuff tends to get more clicks, which means we see more of it, and it's further up the feed, and so on. We need to start innovating solutions to that problem, because I think people are getting slightly frustrated with the devices that they're using, and they don't want to feel like they're slaves to these things. They don't want to walk around feeling like they've just had a message and they check and there's nothing in their pocket, but it's just their leg is trying to give them that shot of dopamine that you get every time you feel a beep. People want alternative products. People want to start experimenting with social media platforms that are different. Maybe it's in the UX, the stuff that you've heard already today, that encourages and incentivizes more meaningful interactions, more powerful, thoughtful discussions. Maybe it's in a way where it's not all about eyeballs and clicks and time spent online. They want something that they enjoy far more rather than feeling compelled to use it. But also, I think we need to start working out, how do we upgrade our governments? What software is going to be available that we can make to help governments or to help established parties or whatever to start being a bit more in tune with the technology of the day? There's so many amazing new things that we could do that we're not doing to make democracy more in tune with how technology now works. Right, final story. About a year ago, I went 100 miles on a driverless truck in the US with no driver. I mean, it's in America, in Florida, where it's basically one straight road, so it's really easy for this truck. But fascinating, exciting, and interesting to be in one of these trucks. And obviously, this is part of the grand AI revolution that's sweeping over our societies and terrifying people. One of the absurd stories that we now keep reading, and this is where journalists are getting it wrong for the third time, is that we're about to enter a period where there's going to be no work, where everyone's going to be made unemployed because these robots will be taking over our jobs. You may have heard the old joke that the factory of the future will only have 2 employees, a man and a dog. Have you heard that one? Yeah, and the man is there to feed the dog, and the dog is there to make sure the man doesn't touch the machines. It's not going to happen. This is ludicrous. And we are brilliant at knowing what jobs we have now that we might lose. We are terrible at trying to figure out what jobs haven't yet been invented or created. I don't think we need to worry about everybody being unemployed at all. What we do need to worry about, though, is whether the inevitable losers from this great revolution are going to have a route to become winners again. Whether it might drive a sort of growing technology-fueled inequality between the people that own the tech, that use the tech, that are brilliant at it, and the people that don't and aren't. And I would always ask this to the people in Silicon Valley that were building driverless trucks, who'd created some amazing jobs and who were brilliant, and I really was impressed by what they were doing. But I would always say, what is a 50-year-old driver who has worked in trucking his entire life, for whom in North Dakota it is probably the best job if you leave school without a university degree? It's pretty well paid, it's pretty well unionized. What is that person supposed to do? What job are they supposed to take when their industry is disrupted? And they would always say something along the lines of, oh yeah, that person should like retrain as a machine learning specialist or robotics engineer. And I think, what are you talking about? That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. And this is what really worries me, that if we see that sort of drift towards growing inequality, or if the losers and the winners get further and further apart, what then happens? I'm just going to show you a couple of quick quotes here. Can you read them at the back? You can read them. I don't want to. Well, I'll read them out quickly. So, machines will take care of more and more of the simpler tasks, so that there will be an increasing surplus of human workers at the lower levels of ability. Technology advances with great rapidity and threatens freedoms at many different points at the same time, increasing dependence of individuals on large organizations, propaganda, and other psychological techniques, invasion of privacy through surveillance devices and computers, etc. Now, this was written by this guy in 1995. That's Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, the last of the neo-Luddites, the last person who, well, I mean, he's a convicted terrorist. He murdered 3 people in the 80s and 90s because he believed that technology was destroying civilization. That stuff, this reads like a New Yorker or a Guardian editorial now. In 1995, this looked like absolute lunacy. What worries me is if we don't work out how to overcome the possible turbulence and the changes, that people will start not doing what he did, but start wanting to smash these machines up. They start seeing them as a force of oppression rather than a force of liberation. And I wonder if this is far more likely that these people are going to retrain as a robotics engineer or a machine learning specialist, far more likely than them being satisfied that their great-great-grandchildren will be far safer because there will be far fewer deaths on the roads. I think they'll be doing this. I think they'll be out on this is a self-driving car that can't move because it's been trapped by someone with spray paint who's just drawn a big stop sign all the way around it. Truck drivers will be out on the streets with their spray cans trying to put in new markers to confuse these machines if they think their industry is being disrupted and that there's no ladders for them to climb up, there's no opportunities that they can take. We cannot let that happen because then all of those wonderful benefits are being lost. So the task here is to work out how can we make sure these benefits, these productivity benefits, these safety benefits are equitably shared. How can we make sure there are realistic routes for the losers of this change? This is so important. Answers there are going to require some pretty bold thinking. People in this room, but from our politicians too, it's for sure. Brand new types of social safety nets. Brand new ways of unionizing people. And I know that Scandinavian countries are quite further ahead than many others in terms of how you unionize in this type of industry. But some people talk blithely about, well, should we nationalize these big AI companies, or should we try to, smash these monopolies up or something like that, which is frankly not all that realistic. But one thing that is realistic is, can we encourage more competition at home? Domestically. What's the fuel of AI? Well, it's data. Well, how do we make sure that new companies have access to data to build better software and better services? Governments hold vast amounts of data that would be incredibly valuable for startup companies. You know this GDPR, so I'm not sure if the word GDPR has been banned from this conference because I get that people are sick of this. But I think and I really enjoyed ignoring all those GDPR emails. So that was a great pleasure to me. But I think one of the most important powers in GDPR is data portability. You're going to have the right to be able to take data back from a company and then do what you want with it. Now, obviously, no one's going to do that on their own. I mean, I'm not going to ask Facebook for loads of my data. What am I going to do with what are they going to send me? A big Excel file with all my data? What am I going to do with that? It's useless. However, it might be quite good if the government were able to incentivize a private sector industry in helping people to get their data easily from them and then sell it on. So, when you've got those aeroplanes, you've got the delayed flights and you've got companies that are there to just help you check your flights and get all the money for you really easily. Or we have this thing in the UK with PPI claims where people have been missold insurance and you have the right to ask for it back, but no one can be bothered because it's too complicated. But there's all these companies that will do it all for you. Well, that's what we need with the enforcing data rights, so that we can make sure there's a much healthier data infrastructure that companies can use to create new competition, which are more regulatable by local governments or by national governments to make sure that this does not happen, because the benefits of this are being more fairly shared. So that's my message, really. I think the question, every time, this is the way I see it, every time we go through a great transformation in our means of communication or our means of production, there's great social change that comes with it. There's great political turbulence that comes with it every time. And our job is to make sure we kind of get through that turbulence. And we need to work out, with my 3 stories, we need to work out how we can regulate these things properly. We need to work out, secondly, with my story of Tommy Robinson, how we can innovate in government to make it more exciting and more in tune with the technology of the day, but also experiment with new models of social media platforms that people actually want. And finally, we need to make sure that we can be more equitable in the way that these benefits are shared, because the task is to make sure that people do not see this technology, as I fear they're beginning to, as a tool of oppression, as something they don't like, as something that they feel they're a slave to rather than a master of, and instead that it becomes something that people feel liberates them and that they love. And that is our task, I think, for the next 10 years. And with that, I'll stop, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I just love when you come here and tell us stories. Yeah. But I was thinking about the first story, do you really think that regulation would help? Wouldn't people just, go around regulation and do things on...
Yeah, I think it will, actually. I think it will. I've got a good story of... in the 1960s, I was fortunate to interview Ralph Nader, who's the guy that's behind a lot of the auto safety regulations in the 1960s. And in the 1960s, people said of the auto industry in the US, you can't regulate it, it's impossible. There were no laws to do with seat belts or shatterproof windscreens, nothing like that. Ralph Nader writes a book in 1965 saying this is really bad, people are dying, kids are dying, we need to enforce safety standards. The entire car industry, General Motors and Ford especially, say it's impossible, the industry will collapse. We won't be able to compete with Japanese car manufacturers. But once a law was passed, the following year, because of such public outrage, General Motors and Ford started to compete with each other about who had the best safety belts and the best shatterproof windscreens. Because they suddenly realized that people did care about that, and it sparked off this competition between them on those different features. And I think we might be heading in a similar way with some of this technology, that if we can work out smart regulation that defends user privacy, that makes sure platforms are places people want to be, or they don't feel addicted, or whatever it happens to be, you can then spark off that competition between them as well. And I think we're actually starting to see that. I think there's little glimmers of that in the tech companies that suggest that this is actually going to work.
Mats, do we have any questions from the audience?
The audience asks if you, Jamie, have listened to the new album by A Perfect Circle called Eat the Elephant.
I might, what is...
Okay. Maybe you should listen to it.
Okay.
Do I look like someone from the band or something? Is that what
no, I don't know. That's a...
Okay, that's I wasn't expecting that question, but...
interesting question.
The answer is no.
Easy answer. Okay. Thank you so much for coming to Webbdagarna Gothenburg. Thank you.
Thank you.